Wi-Fi testing is highly recommended. However, it is likely that you're not going to have every single Android device with all the different screen resolutions and hardware configurations. To solve this, you need to use Android Emulation. Now, before we can install the Android SDK, we need to install Java. The reason why we need to install Java is because Android relies heavily on the Java programming language, so we need the JDK and the JRE environments installed. To do this, I'll open up Google and type in Java JDK and click on the first link. Then I'll click on Download Java, and then after that, I can accept the license agreement and click on the link to the .dmg file, which is an executable installable file for OSX. Once the file has downloaded, double-click on the DMG file and run through the installation. So now that I've installed Java, what I'd like to do now is install the Android Studio. This is the easiest way to get set up with the Android SDK or Software Development Kit. So first of all, visit developer.android.com and then download the Android Studio. Once the download has completed, go ahead and double click on the file and drag and drop the Android Studio over your applications folder, and that will copy it across to your applications directory. Once extracted, go ahead and close out of there and go to your applications directory and double click on Android Studio. This will then begin the installation of the Android SDK. Also, it will install the latest Android SDK that's available. And also, it will set up all the other configurations. So just go through the installation with all the default settings in place and you should be good to go. Now, the Android Studio itself is an IDE that allows you to develop Android apps, native or Cordova. So it's quite a nice little IDE or editor. However, it's not necessary. The SDK is installed in your library directory. So if you don't want to keep the Android Studio in your applications directory, you can delete that. That's not a problem, just as long as you don't delete the Android SDK, which is hidden away in your user's library directory. Once the installation of the Android Studio has finished, Android Studio itself will open up. This is the IDE editor, so you can delete that now if you don't want it. So now we need to make sure that our terminal is able to find the Android SDK to then compile our Cordova applications. And Cordova will need to know where the Android SDK is so it can put our APK files together. So firstly, open your terminal, and secondly, type in open-e, then the tilde symbol, \profile. This .profile file defines global variables so that your terminal can find certain applications. So firstly, I've said export Android_home, and this is very case sensitive, so Android home must be all caps, equals tilde /library/Android/SDK. The tilde / takes you to your users directory. So that's like me clicking on my Mac hard drive, then going to users, and then going to Lawrence Turton, which is my user account. Within that directory, I have my library, Android, and SDK. But instead of going all the way from the root hard drive saying users, Lawrence Turton, and so forth, I've just put in tilde /. So that's a nice little shortcut. Next, I'll type in export path all caps equals $path colon, and then we type in $Android_home. Again, very case sensitive, and that's targeting the variable we've just created, which in turn is targeting our Android SDK directory. Now, within our Android SDK directory, we have the tools directory. So I'll put in \tools. Next, we can also export another path in the Android SDK. So I'm going to say export all caps path equals Android_home /platform-tools. That's another directory we need to target. And then finally, put the colon in there and say $path. That's it. Once you've added this into your .profile file, go ahead and exit out. And now we need to tell the terminal that we've modified our .profile file. So the way we refresh our profile is we type in /tilde \profile and hit return. Now, to make sure those changes take an effect, press Command-N to open a new terminal window. Within that new terminal window, type in Android, and hopefully the Android SDK should boot up. The Android SDK Manager allows us to install software development kits, or SDKs, for the different Android operating systems. First, make sure you have the Android SDK platform and build tools selected for installation if they are not already installed. Now, the reason why the SDK Manager doesn't download every single package that's available is because a lot of the older Android platforms are obsolete and are no longer being supported by Google, so there's pretty much no need to download those SDKs. On top of that, it takes up a lot of hard drive space, and you only really need to install the packages that you want for your testing. Apart from the build tools and platform tools there to do with the actual build process that creates your application. Now, as long as you have your build tools and platform tools installed, I'd also like to install Android Lollipop, which is Android 5.1.1 and is recommended for Cordova, otherwise you'll get an error during the build process. So I can install all packages to do with this OS. However, I can pick and choose, and I'm just going to eliminate some of those packages that I don't need because it's taking up precious hard drive space. However, I am going to include some system images to do with ARM and the x86 or Intel Atom processors. So what are system images? Well, you have the ARM architecture and you have the Intel Atom architecture and potentially a few others. But what it's really doing is it's mapping hardware. So if you're to think about your device, it more than likely has an ARM processor inside, which is a very, very popular processor because it saves on power. But also you could have, let's say, an Intel processor in there or something of another kind. However, ARM and Intel are the most popular, with ARM being the most popular. And what the system image allows you to do is map that hardware architecture in, let's say, your emulator so that you can test that your application works on a device that has an ARM processor. And likewise, the same for an Intel processor and other processors. Now, it's not necessarily required. In most cases, your application will be able to run on both architectures no problem because you're creating a hybrid application, but there can be some plugins that are very specific, which we'll talk about later. However, that's what the system images are. They just allow you to map out hardware configurations and instruction sets that are for certain processors. So after selecting the packages that I want for testing environments and the build process, I can then go ahead and say install these packages. A window will pop up and you need to accept all of the licenses that are there. So you can go ahead and click on it and say accept license for all those different licenses. And then you can go ahead and say install. Once we have our SDK downloaded, it's time to create an Android virtual device, or AVD for short. You can either type Android AVD to go directly to the AVD Manager, but I already have the Android SDK open, so I'll just drop down the Tools menu and click on Manage AVDs. Once the AVD Manager is open, we can now create a new AVD from scratch or choose from some predefined definitions of the more popular Android devices out there. I'll create an AVD from the Nexus 5 definition and slightly customize it to my needs. First, we have the AVD name, which cannot contain spaces or special characters. This name is very important as we can use it in the terminal to target this specific emulator. I'll just call it Nexus_5. Then we have a list of devices with different screen resolutions. Next we have the target, which is the OS that will be emulated. In my case, I'll emulate the Android Lollipop OS. We can also choose to emulate a CPU/ABI. It's advisable if you have an Intel processor in your computer to emulate an Intel Atom processor on your AVD. Next, we have the ability to say whether our emulated device has a hardware keyboard. If so, the virtual keyboard will be disabled. I want the virtual keyboard, so I'll uncheck this checkbox. Then we have a choice of skins to choose from. You can have a skin with dynamic controls, no skin at all, or other various skins that give a device-like appearance. Next, you can emulate or use a webcam connected to your computer for the front and rear cameras on the AVD device. Next, I can allocate how much RAM or random access memory my AVD device can have, so that'll be 2048 megabytes. Then I can define the VM heap size. This allows me to allocate memory to single applications. So any application that you run on your AVD will be allowed up to 64 megabytes of random access memory, and then if it goes over that, it will get a quota error. Also, we can emulate the internal storage and additional storage, such as an SD card. Finally, we have some emulation options. You can either have snapshot or use host GPU to speed up the emulator. Note they cannot be selected both at the same time. Once we've set all the options, click OK and the AVD will be created. Next, we can select our newly created AVD and then click Start to launch and test our emulator. We can also choose to scale down the display if it's too large for our computer's screen. So I'll check Scale Display to real size. This process takes a long time depending on your circumstances. You will need a fairly powerful computer if you want to use Android emulation in any professional capacity for testing your apps. Once the emulator is fully loaded, we now know it works. Exit out of the emulator, AVD Manager, and the Android SDK Manager. Now please make sure you've already reviewed OSX Wi-Fi testing and OSX iOS simulation, as that will ensure that you install the correct Node.js version and you have the PhoneGap and Cordova programs installed. After that, cd into your apps directory and then type Cordova platform add Android. If we review our apps platforms directory, we can now see there is an Android folder with an Android project ready to be compiled and run. Also, please note that this project is still not ready to be compiled to the Android emulator, and that's due to the fact that the minimum SDK preference is not set up correctly by default. It needs to be a higher minimum SDK version in order for you to not receive an error. So please open up your app's root directory, and in there you'll see the config.xml file. If you open that up in your favorite editor and then take a look at the minimum SDK preference, and you want to set that to at least 14. To run this project on the emulator, go back to the terminal, make sure the terminal's still focused on our apps directory, and then type Cordova run Android. This process will take several minutes, and eventually your app will open in the emulator automatically. Finally, to finish off this lecture, I will once again launch the AVD Manager by typing into the terminal Android AVD. Then under Definitions, I will create a new AVD from the Nexus 6 definition. After going through the options, I'll quickly create the AVD. Now I want to show you how to target this specific emulator. Take a note of the AVD name, as this is very important. Close the AVD Manager. Make sure the terminal is focused on our apps directory, and then type Cordova run Android --target equals, and then in quotation marks, type the name of the AVD exactly as noted before. So in my case, it's Nexus_6. You'll notice my Nexus 6 emulator is now being targeted and not the default Nexus 5 emulator. And there we have it. We've now successfully created 2 Android emulators on OSX.